welcome to LM Teaches English. In this video we're going to go through the poem Exposure by Wilfred Owen from the AQA Power and Conflict anthology. So as usual we'll go through the context, so we'll talk about the title and the poet. Then we'll do a recap of what the poem's about, looking at some key quotes here. There's quite a few because it's such a great poem. And then I'll give you some possible comparisons and a question that you can answer, an essay question. So before we do all of that, you'll need to read the poem. So please pause the video if you haven't done so already. Okay, let's get started. So the title of this poem, Exposure, has two, well, maybe even more than two meanings, but one meaning is when you're exposed. So exposure can be a cause of death. So it means exposure to the elements or to the weather. And then also you can be exposed as being your hiding place, if you like, in a war zone. So it can have war references. And you can be exposed as being, I don't know, if you're caught in a lie or something. So we'll look, I know I said two, but I thought of another one as I was writing. So there's three. So we'll look at those. We'll refer back to those as we're analysing our quotes in a second. Wilfred Owen is an interesting poet, so this is somebody where you would really want to know his background because he was actually a soldier in the First World War, and that is extremely significant because he would have had first-hand experience, which I think is what makes this poem so powerful, maybe above some of the other poets who didn't actually experience what they're writing about, because he actually fought in the war. And the obviously the sad part that I think everybody knows by now is that he died maybe a day or a couple of days before the war ended. So it sort of felt like he died unnecessarily. He also was signed off. I don't know. He was on medical leave maybe from the war for an injury that he sustained, and in that time he actually met other famous war poets. I think Siegfried Sassoon is one of them. So he was injured and he actually asked to go back in and fight, and then that was obviously when he died, just before the war ended. I think if he had been fighting in a modern war, he probably would have been diagnosed with PTSD, as it was called shell shock in those days. It wasn't taken quite as seriously. So this poem definitely explores ideas of PTSD. And if we compare this to a pre-World War I poem, you'll see how very different it is, because in this poem we get to see the soldier's point of view, and we actually see that war is not all it's cracked up to be. It's not all about honour and going into the valley of death, as the Charge of the Light Brigade says. It's actually quite the opposite. It's gruesome and grim, and you watch people die in the worst ways imaginable, and if the weather doesn't get you, then the boredom will, and if the boredom doesn't get you, then the soldiers will, and the enemy will. So it's not as exciting as perhaps the propaganda posters made it out to be. And that is what this poem's about. It's about a man who is sitting in his trench perhaps, and he's just waiting for something to happen. So throughout the poem he repeats, but nothing happens. What are we doing here? Is it that we are dying? He's got all these questions. And it's boredom as much as anything, but also it's the cold, it's the weather, and also it's important to remember this poem was written on the coldest day in history ever recorded up to that point. So he wrote this poem on the coldest day. So not only is he fighting against the exposure in the sense of war and the enemy, but he's also fighting the elements, as in the weather. And that first line of the poem, "Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us," perfectly sums up all of those things, doesn't it? So brains, there are connotations there of mental health. There's perhaps from the boredom, or it's not just any kind of boredom though, it's that boredom when you're waiting for something to happen. So it's anticipation as well, the waiting to die perhaps. Brains ache, obviously that's from the cold weather. We've all had a brain freeze. Not a nice feeling. Imagine that continuously. And then, of course, we've got the merciless ice winds that knife us. So he's being very clear here that it's the winds and the ice. So it's the weather. But the fact that it's coming from the east suggests it's the enemy. Enemy, yeah. And the use of the verb knife us implies, again, he's talking more about the war and fighting. But again, if you've been out in that really, really cold weather, you'll know that feeling when the wind hits you and it does feel like lots of little stabbing all over your body. So he's using that double meaning of the east winds, meaning literally the winds, and also metaphorically, just to get a bit of terminology in there, metaphorically he's also talking about the enemy. And of course, the winds kniving us would be what technique? Personification, indeed. Well done, you. Which just kind of makes the enemy makes the weather come alive almost as another enemy. So beautiful first line, I would say key quote there that to remember to use almost any comparison, anything you write about this poem, I would use that quote because it just sums up nicely what the themes of the poem. The next quote is also nice because it's confusing, I suppose, at first read. So we keep awake because the night is silent. So it's confusing because obviously a silent night sounds like an ideal condition in which to sleep. Then again, if we remember where they are, why do you think silence would be so disconcerting for these soldiers? Well done, of course, because silence means the enemy could be creeping up. If there's noise going on in the background, like you can hear bombs going off and aeroplanes and whatnot, and gunfire, then you would almost feel more, I was going to say comforted, that's the wrong word, reassured, because you know that at least they're out there fighting. But when there's silence, it seems like you're just waiting for them to come and get you and you don't know where they are. So it's actually worse in a war zone. So first of all, that kind of jarring idea, that almost juxtaposed keeping awake and silent, and night as well is confusing, but then you understand why that would be so disconcerting for them. Again, next line that's confusing maybe is, but nothing happens. Well, surely they should be happy that nothing's happening. They're not dying. Shouldn't that be a good thing? But no, of course, they know what they're there for. They're there to either fight or die, or both. So the fact that nothing is happening is actually more frightening. You know that feeling when you're dreading doing something and the dread was actually worse than the thing itself? It's kind of that feeling that he's trying to convey. And also the boredom, I must mention that again, because I think the propaganda at that time that was going around would have led people to believe that war was great fun, that you would go with all your pals and you'd have almost like a school trip and you'd be, you know, firing guns. Like who wouldn't want to fire a gun? This is great. And then you'd be playing football and doing all these wonderful things. And I think Owen here is trying to show people that it wasn't actually like that. It's not fun. It's actually very boring when it's not life-threatening and when it's not scary as hell. So you can understand why this poem perhaps might not have been published straight away, because the government wouldn't have wanted people to see this, because it would have put them off fighting in war, which shows you how they're being exposed. The government, the lie that the government was telling people, as we said, beginning with the word exposure, is being exposed in this poem. The government are being exposed for lying and saying war is a jolly holiday when it's not. The next line that we picked up here is, we hear the mad gusts tugging at the wire, like twitching agonies, I think that's meant to be, of men among its brambles. So lovely reference again to mental health, with we've got mad and twitching. So here he's saying we hear the mad gusts tugging at the wire. So here literally what's happening is he can hear the wind going through the wires all around them. So probably the barbed wire, maybe that they've put up between their trenches. So you can hear that going, and in his mind, the only image that he can compare that to at this point in time, because it's all he's thinking of, is a twitching agonies of men among the brambles. So this image of soldiers being shot down inside while they were near those barbed wire fences, and their bodies are caught inside the fences, and perhaps they're being shot at so much their bodies are twitching, or maybe as they're dying they're twitching in agony. So it's a very nasty image that Owen has painted here, but that's just an insight into what was going on in his mind at the time. So PTSD, mental health, all of that, and this simile it just creates such a strong image of all of those people dying in such agonizing ways. But at this point, like he said, nothing's happening. He's just imagining these things. So in the nothingness, we can almost put that here as well, next to nothing. Your imagination runs away with you. I mean, we don't know. These soldiers who are here could have seen other bits of war, other battlegrounds. So they might have seen these things before, and so they know what's coming, which again makes it even worse. Another reference to the weather. War lasts, rain soaks, clouds sags, stormy. They've also got the next line here: sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow. So the amount of S's in there create that sibilant sound, which is like guns or bombs in the distance, or even going past your ears. So suddenly it's happened, the thing that they were dreading. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. So the enemy is there, they're being attacked, the bullets are flying through the air. But he does go on to say that it's less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow. So actually these bullets are less deadly than the weather. So he's implying that the weather is the real threat here. And interestingly, at the end we have this stanza where he talks about going through the dead bodies and looking in their faces, perhaps to see, identify them so they can write back to their family and see who's died. And there's this line, all their eyes are ice. So perhaps it's not even that they were killed by war, they were killed by the weather, which again just shows the futility of all of this. Absolutely pointless exercise to have men sitting around in ditches, in holes, like animals, just dying because of exposure to the weather, because they're just freezing. And it just shows you how futile, how pointless war is when you're not even fighting. But even so, even the fighting itself is pointless. But there we go, that is Exposure, and there's lots more to say about that poem, so please go away and annotate it by yourselves as well. And if you've got any points to make, please get the discussion going in the comments, because poetry is best when it's being discussed and lots of people are interpreting it. The question I would like to give you for this poem is about conflict, and I would like you to compare it to another war poem. So in this case we will go for Bayonet Charge. So compare how the poets of Exposure and Bayonet Charge present conflict. Okay, and that's as simple as that. I'm going to leave it nice and open for you because there's lots to explore between those two poems, linking especially with the way the government has lied to them. So we've run out of time, but see if you can think of any other poems that you would link this one to as well, and put them in the comments below. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks for watching. See you soon. Bye.